Imagine being one of the finest pilots in the world, flying a multi-million-dollar plane into complete darkness, only to be laughed at by the enemy you're supposed to hunt. In 1941, RAF night fighters were the Blind Sentinels, burning hours of fuel while Ju-88s slipped through like ghosts. But in 1943, a hidden gyroscopic brain turned mockery into massacre. Tonight, we reveal how the Gyro Gunsight stripped the Luftwaffe of its arrogance and changed aerial combat forever. Most of us were raised on the legend of the cat's eye pilots, men who supposedly possessed a biological gift for seeing German bombers in the pitch black of the English night. We were told that courage and carrots were the secret to winning the Blitz. But the reality is far more clinical and perhaps more fascinating. While the public celebrated individual heroism, a quiet revolution was happening inside the cockpits of the RAF's night fighters. It wasn't instinct that finally cleared the skies of the Junkers 88. It was a secret piece of mechanical wizardry that did the math the human brain couldn't handle. Today, we're looking at the moment the gentleman's club of aviation met the cold calculus of the Gyro Gunsight, and how a single black box turned mocked sentinels into the most efficient hunters in history.
Many of us remember the stories of the Blitz, the searchlight sweeping the London sky, and the harrowing whistles of falling high explosives. But there is a quieter, more desperate history that took place miles above the soot and the sirens. In the early years of the 1940s, the Royal Air Force faced a humiliating reality. They were effectively blind in their own backyard. We like to think of the RAF as the masters of the sky after the Battle of Britain, but when the sun went down, that mastery vanished. The German Luftwaffe's Junkers 88s, the predators of the dark, were roaming the English countryside with near impunity, while our boys were up there squinting through plexiglass, hoping for a lucky moonbeam to catch a wingtip. It's hard to fathom now, in an age of satellite GPS and infrared, just how lonely and terrifying that darkness was. Imagine driving a car at 300 miles per hour through a thick fog with your headlights turned off. That was the baseline for a night fighter pilot in 1941. They were mocked not out of cruelty, but out of a genuine sense of futility. The press called them the Blind Sentinels, a title that stung because it was true. You see, the standard defensive strategy relied on ground-controlled interception, which was about as precise as throwing a dart in a dark room. By the time a controller radioed a pilot with a bearing, the Ju-88, a remarkably fast and versatile machine, had already dropped its payload and turned for the channel. The Junkers 88 wasn't just another bomber, it was a technical marvel of German engineering that seemed to mock the very idea of British interception. It was faster than most of our twin-engine Defenders and possessed a defensive armament that turned any tail chase into a suicide mission for the RAF. Our pilots were flying Bolton-Paul Defiants, planes with a turret but no forward-firing guns, or early Blenheims that were sluggish and outmatched. History suggests that during this period, the ratio of sorties to successful kills was abysmal. We were burning fuel and risking our finest air crews for the sake of patrolling, which was often just a polite word for wandering the clouds. But the mockery didn't just come from the enemy, it came from within the ranks of the military establishment itself. There was a prevailing old guard mentality that suggested night fighting was a gentleman's game of instinct and cat's eyes. You might recall the propaganda about Cat's Eyes Cunningham and the claim that eating carrots helped pilots see in the dark. In reality, that was a clever bit of disinformation to hide the birth of airborne intercept radar. However, even that early radar was a fickle, temperamental beast. It was bulky, it failed constantly due to the vibration of the engines, and it required a navigator to interpret a series of green blips that looked more like static than a German bomber. Therefore, the stage was set for a technological collision. The British were tired of being the Blind Sentinels, and the German crews were becoming overconfident in their predator status. The Ju-88 pilots began to fly straighter, more predictable paths, believing the night was their impenetrable shield. They didn't realize that in the laboratories of the Ministry of Aircraft Production, the calculus of death was being rewritten. We weren't just looking for a better radar, we were looking for a way to actually hit what we finally managed to see. The era of the lucky shot was about to end, and the era of the Gyro Gunsight was about to begin, turning those mocked sentinels into the most lethal hunters the night had ever seen. In the early days of the air war, there was a romantic, almost Victorian notion that defending the night skies was a matter of individual pluck and superior eyesight. This was the era of the Gentlemen's Club of Aviation, where pilots were celebrated like star athletes for their supposed biological superiority. We were told stories of men who could see in the dark like owls, fueled by a steady diet of garden vegetables. It was a comforting myth for a nation under siege, but it masked a grim mathematical reality that was playing out in the cold air over the Midlands. While the public was focused on Cat's Eyes Cunningham, the military leadership was quietly confronting the calculus of death, a realization that human instinct was no longer a match for the speed of modern machinery. The problem with the Gentlemen's Club approach was that it relied on a visual acquisition range that was virtually non-existent at night. By the time a pilot in a Blenheim or a Defiant actually spotted the exhaust flames of a German bomber, he was often less than 200 yards away. At those speeds, that leaves exactly zero room for error. You'd have to realize that the Luftwaffe's Ju-88 was a masterpiece of versatility, capable of outrunning many of the very fighters sent to catch it. It wasn't just a bomber, it was a ghost. History suggests that for every 100 sorties flown by the RAF's early night fighters, the number of actual intercepts could be counted on one hand. The gentlemen were brave, but they were essentially trying to catch a bullet with a magnifying glass. This disparity created a terrifying calculus of death for the British. Every night the Ju-88s returned meant more factories leveled and more homes destroyed, while the RAF was losing its most experienced pilots not to enemy fire, but to the sheer exhaustion and disorientation of flying blind. The math was simple and brutal. If we couldn't find a way to mathematically predict where the enemy would be, rather than just looking for where he was, the air defense of Great Britain would eventually collapse under the weight of its own inefficiency. We were spending more in fuel and airframes than we were inflicting in damage on the Luftwaffe.
But as the winter of 1940 bled into the spring of 1941, the Gentlemen's Club was forcibly retired to make way for the technologists. The arrival of the Bristol Beaufighter changed the equation entirely. This wasn't a nimble, graceful dogfighter. It was a twin-engined beast, built like a tank and packed with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns. It was designed to deliver a massive, concentrated blow, if and only if it could be guided to the target. This necessitated the integration of the first airborne interception AI radar sets, specifically the Mark IV. Suddenly, the pilot wasn't flying alone. He was flying with a navigator who was staring at a cathode ray tube, trying to translate flickering green pulses into a three-dimensional intercept. The battle shifted from a test of vision to a test of coordination and geometry. The calculus of death began to lean in our favor when the RAF established the first radar-assisted kills. On the night of November 19, 1940, a Beaufighter of No. 604 Squadron successfully used its onboard radar to stalk and destroy a U-88, proving that the night could be conquered by physics. It wasn't a cat's eye that did it. It was a radio wave reflecting off a German wing. But even with radar, a new problem emerged. Finding the enemy was one thing. Actually hitting him at high speed while maneuvering in total darkness was another matter entirely. The radar could get you to the tail of a bomber, but the human eye still struggled with deflection shooting, the art of aiming where the enemy will be. But this is where the story takes its most fascinating turn. Even with a heavy fighter like the Beaufighter and a radar like the Mark IV, the pilots were still using primitive, fixed ring-and-bead sights. To hit a U-88 banking in the dark, you had to perform complex mental trigonometry in the heat of a 300-mile-per-hour chase. Most pilots simply missed, their tracer fire arcing uselessly into the void. The calculus had brought us to the doorstep of the enemy, but it couldn't turn the key. We had solved the problem of the search, but we had yet to solve the problem of the strike. The gentleman's club was gone, but the machines were still demanding a level of precision that the human brain alone couldn't provide. In the grand mythology of World War II, we often focus on the courage of the individual pilot, the white silk scarf, the steady hand, and the unwavering eye. But by 1942, as the air war evolved into a high-speed clash of heavy machinery, courage was becoming a secondary requirement. The hard truth that many veteran pilots had to swallow was that bravery on its own was no longer enough to win the night. The sky had become a laboratory of physics, and the most dangerous variable in that laboratory was something called the geometry of the kill. To bring down a Junkers 88 at 2 in the morning, a pilot needed to be more than a hero. He needed to be a human computer, capable of solving three-dimensional calculus in his head while flying at the edge of a stall. To understand why this was so difficult, we have to look at the mechanics of deflection shooting. Many of us who grew up around machinery or went hunting understand the concept of leading a target. If you're shooting at a bird in flight, you don't aim where the bird is, you aim where it's going to be by the time the shot arrives. In the air, however, this isn't a two-dimensional problem, it's a chaotic dance in 3 dimensions. You aren't just dealing with the target's speed, you're dealing with your own speed, the curvature of your turn, the drop of the shells due to gravity, and the windage caused by the slipstream. During the early night fighting years, pilots used a fixed reflector sight. It was essentially a glowing ring projected onto a glass pane. It was a fine instrument for a stationary target, but in a high-speed pursuit, it was almost useless. If a U-88 was banking hard to the left, the pilot had to mentally calculate the lead and literally aim his entire aircraft into empty space, well ahead of the enemy's nose. If he aimed directly at the bomber, his shells would pass harmlessly behind it every single time. This was the geometry of the kill, and for most pilots, it was a nightmare. History suggests that even the best ace pilots were only hitting their targets with about 5 to 10% of the rounds they fired. The rest was just expensive lead being scattered into the English countryside. This inefficiency created a massive tactical problem. The U-88 was a sturdy bird, and it didn't just fall out of the sky because it saw a tracer. To down a Junkers, you had to hit the engines or the fuel cells, which were relatively small targets on a maneuvering aircraft. Because our pilots had to guess the lead, they would often fire long bursts, hoping to spray the area and get a lucky hit. But this had a consequence. The Beaufighter and the Mosquito only carried a limited amount of 20mm ammunition. A pilot who guessed wrong twice was suddenly a defenseless observer in a very dangerous sky. We were essentially sending our best men up to play a game of high-stakes poker, where the house, in this case the laws of physics, had the deck stacked against them. But it wasn't just the math of the lead that was the problem, it was the physiology of the pilot. When a pilot enters a steep turn to follow a maneuvering bomber, G-force, centrifugal force, pulls the blood from his brain. His vision begins to narrow, and his ability to perform complex mental arithmetic drops through the floor. Imagine trying to solve a long division problem while someone is sitting on your chest and spinning you in a centrifuge. That was the reality of the Night Interceptor. The Gentlemen's Club pilots were finding that their instincts were failing them because their bodies couldn't keep up with the technical demands of the calculus of death.
The gap between finding the enemy and killing the enemy began to widen.
We had the radar to get us close, and we had the cannons to do the damage, but the bridge between the two, the gun sight, was a relic of a slower era. The Luftwaffe crews knew this. They developed a maneuver called a corkscrew, a violent rolling dive that changed the deflection geometry every half second. To a pilot using a fixed sight, a corkscrewing Ju-88 was virtually impossible to hit. It was like trying to thread a needle while riding a roller coaster. The frustration in the RAF mess halls was palpable. Pilots were returning from missions having seen the enemy, having chased the enemy, but having failed to shred the enemy. This failure wasn't just a blow to morale, it was a strategic crisis. The Junkers 88 was becoming bolder, flying lower and faster, knowing that as long as they kept moving, the British Blind Sentinels couldn't land a killing blow. The bravery of the RAF was unquestioned, but bravery doesn't change the trajectory of a 20mm shell. We needed a way to take the guesswork out of the cockpit. We needed a device that could feel the turn of the plane, measure the speed of the wind, and tell the pilot exactly where to point his nose. We needed to automate the calculus of death so the pilot could get back to the business of flying. But the solution didn't come from a pilot's intuition. It came from the world of gyroscopes and precision engineering. While the crews were struggling in the air, engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment were perfecting a device that would effectively freeze time. They were working on a sight that didn't just sit there like a glowing ring, but actually moved and reacted to the aircraft's movement. They were building the Mark IIC Gyro Gunsight. It was a piece of technology so secret and so advanced that pilots were told to destroy it rather than let it fall into enemy hands. The introduction of the gyro was the moment the geometry of the kill shifted from a pilot's burden to a machine's specialty. No longer would a man have to guess the lead while his vision was blurring from G-forces. The sight would do the math for him. It was the end of the romantic era of the cat's eyes and the beginning of the era of the technological predator. The Ju-88s were about to find out that the dark wasn't just full of brave men, it was now full of mathematicians with wings. If you've ever spent time under the hood of a vintage car or tinkered with a mechanical watch, you understand the beauty of a device that does exactly what it's told every single time. In 1943, the RAF introduced a device that was, for its time, as revolutionary as the first silicon chip. This was the Mark IIC Gyro Gunsight. To the uninitiated, it looked like a standard piece of cockpit equipment, a heavy, black-cased box with a glass screen. But inside, it housed a mechanical brain that utilized the invisible hand of gyroscopic precession to solve the problems that had been killing our pilots for years. The bravery of the pilots hadn't changed, and the speed of the Ju-88 hadn't decreased, but the math of the encounter had been entirely automated. To understand the Mark IIC, you have to imagine the invisible hand as a ghost navigator sitting on the pilot's shoulder. Before this, a pilot had to look at a Ju-88 and think, he's at 300 yards, banking at 30 degrees, so I need to aim 2 rings ahead of his nose. By the time he finished that thought, the Ju-88 had moved and the calculation was obsolete. The Mark IIC changed the game by making the aim point fluid. The genius lay in the gyroscopes. As the pilot pulled the aircraft into a turn, the gyroscopes inside the sight would resist that movement, lagging behind just enough to calculate the exact deflection needed. On the glass screen, the glowing reticle, the aiming dot, was no longer fixed to the center of the plane. Instead, it floated. It wandered across the glass in direct proportion to how hard the pilot was turning. If the pilot wanted to hit the Ju-88, he no longer had to aim at empty air. He simply had to place that floating dot directly on the enemy's fuselage. The invisible hand was doing the lead computing for him, adjusting for speed, distance, and gravity in real time. Many of us who remember the transition from manual tools to power tools can appreciate the shock this caused.
Pilots who had spent years missing targets suddenly found they couldn't miss. It was as if the bullets were being magnetically drawn to the German engines. But there was a catch, a specific technical requirement that made the Mark IIC a thinking man's weapon. The pilot had to span the target. On the side of the sight was a dial that the pilot would turn to match the wingspan of the aircraft he was chasing, in this case about 65 feet for a Ju-88. By twisting a throttle grip to frame the bomber's wings within a circle of glowing diamonds on the sight, the pilot was feeding the invisible hand the final piece of the puzzle: range. Once the range was set and the turn was established, the Mark IIC became an executioner. It didn't matter if the Ju-88 began its famous corkscrew maneuver. As long as the pilot kept those glowing diamonds around the enemy's wings, the gun sight would continuously update the solution. History suggests that when the Mark IIC was first deployed in combat, the kill-per-hit ratio didn't just improve, it nearly quadrupled. The Luftwaffe, for the first time in the war, began to feel a sense of inexplicable dread. Their best pilots, men who had survived hundreds of missions by outmaneuvering British fire, were being shredded in the first 5 seconds of an engagement.
The Germans were baffled. They assumed the British had developed a new type of homing shell or a radar-guided turret. They couldn't conceive of a world where a pilot could simply point and click. They didn't realize that the invisible hand was taking the human error out of the cockpit. The Mark IIC was essentially the world's first analog combat computer. It allowed the pilot to focus entirely on the green part of the loop, the flying and the strategy, while the purple part, the lethal payoff, was handled by the gyros. The tactical advantage shifted overnight. The UJ-88, which had once been the predator of the dark, found itself in a new reality, where its speed and agility were no longer defensive assets. In fact, the faster the UJ-88 tried to turn to escape, the more information it gave to the Mark IIC's gyroscopes, and the more accurately the sight would calculate the lead. The enemy's own defensive maneuvers were being used against them to ensure their destruction. This was the invisible hand at work, a silent mechanical revolution that happened in the dark. It turned the cockpit from a place of frantic, sweaty guesswork into a refined laboratory of precision. For the men 65 and older who appreciate the weight of a well-made machine, the Mark IIC represents the pinnacle of that era, a device that didn't just make the pilot's job easier, it made his victory inevitable. The Blind Sentinels were blind no more. They had been given the eyes of a god and the aim of a machine. As with all great technological leaps, the arrival of the Mark IIC Gyro Gunsight led to a period that surviving WWII crews would later describe with hushed tones of disbelief. By early 1944, the transition was complete. The invisible hand of the gyroscope had been married to the raw power of the de Havilland Mosquito and the Bristol Beaufighter. What followed wasn't just a series of successful interceptions, it was a systematic dismantling of the German night bomber force, a midnight massacre that fundamentally altered the cost-benefit analysis of the Air Ministry in Berlin. For years, the UJ-88 had relied on a specific tactical edge, the slashing attack. They would use their speed to dive through British airspace, drop their ordnance, and then use a series of high-G maneuvers to shake off any pursuers. They were used to British tracers trailing behind them, a visible sign of a pilot struggling with the geometry of the kill. But as the 7,000-word history of this conflict suggests, the therefore of our story is that the introduction of the gyro sight rendered those maneuvers not just useless, but fatal.
On the night of January 21, 1944, during the opening stages of Operation Steinbock, often called the Baby Blitz, the Luftwaffe sent over 400 aircraft towards London. Among them were the elite UJ-88 crews. They expected the usual game of hide and seek. Instead, they flew into a wall of mathematical precision. The RAF's Mosquitoes, now equipped with both advanced centimetric radar and the Mark IIC sight, didn't just find the bombers, they deleted them. Reports from that night describe UJ-88s being literally shredded mid-air. One RAF pilot noted that he didn't even have to think about the lead. He simply followed the floating diamond on his glass, squeezed the trigger for a 2-second burst, and watched the Junkers port engine erupt in a magnesium-white flash. The impact on the Luftwaffe's morale cannot be overstated. When a pilot survives a dogfight, he returns with a story of how he outflew the enemy. But during the Midnight Massacre, the German pilots who did manage to limp home had no stories to tell, only questions. They couldn't explain how the British were hitting them from extreme angles and at high speeds where a hit should have been physically impossible. History suggests that during Steinbock, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 330 aircraft in just a few months. For every ton of bombs dropped on London, the Germans were paying a price in elite crews and irreplaceable airframes that they simply could not afford. The predator had officially become the prey. Therefore, the German High Command was forced into a humiliating retreat. They began to pull their remaining UJ-88s back from the night bombing role, reassigning them to defensive duties or long-range maritime reconnaissance where they wouldn't have to face the automated wrath of the RAF. The night skies over England, which had been a theater of terror for 3 years, suddenly fell quiet. The Midnight Massacre proved that technology, when properly integrated into the hands of brave men, creates a force multiplier that can break the will of even the most disciplined enemy. The calculus of death had been solved, and the answer was a pile of UJ-88 wreckage scattered across the fields of southern England. As the sun rose over the silent airfields of East Anglia in the summer of 1945, the roar of the Merlin and Hercules engines began to fade into the history books. The Midnight Massacre was over, and the UJ-88 was no longer a threat to the homes and hearths of the British people. But for those of us who look back at this era with an eye for engineering and a respect for the old ways, the story of the Mark IIC Gyro doesn't end with the armistice. It echoes. It echoes in the way we fly, the way we fight, and the way we interact with the machines that define our modern lives. When we look at a modern fighter jet today, an F-22 Raptor or a Lightning II, we see a cockpit dominated by glass and digital projections. We see heads-up displays, or HUDs, that tell a pilot exactly where to point his nose to intercept a target moving at twice the speed of sound. It's easy to look at that and see pure space-age magic. But if you peel back the layers of software and silicon, you will find the DNA of the Mark IIC, those floating diamonds that allowed a 21-year-old RAF pilot to shred a UJ-88 in the pitch black of 1944, were the direct ancestors of the symbology used by today's top guns. We moved from the invisible hand of mechanical gyroscopes to the invisible hand of lines of code, but the goal remained the same, taking the burden of the calculus of death off the human mind. There is a certain nostalgia in realizing that the Blind Sentinels were the first humans to ever experience what we now call augmented reality. Long before Silicon Valley was a glimmer in the world's eye, a pilot in a wooden Mosquito was looking through a piece of glass and seeing a calculated future, a prediction of where a bullet would land. This was the moment the bridge was built between human intuition and machine precision.
Many of us remember the days when a car required a feel for the clutch and a sense of the timing. The Mark IIC was the beginning of the end for that purely manual world. It was the first time we admitted that at a certain speed, the human animal needs a mechanical partner to survive.
But perhaps the most profound echo is the shift in the nature of bravery itself. We often worry today that automation makes us soft or that it robs us of the skill our fathers and grandfathers possessed. Yet, as the history of the night fighters shows, the gyro didn't make the pilots less brave, it simply changed the stakes. It allowed them to move past the frustration of guesswork and into a realm of higher strategy. It didn't fly the plane for them, it just made sure that when they put their lives on the line and finally pulled the trigger, their courage wasn't wasted on a miss. When we see the automated world around us today, the self-driving features in our cars, the precision of our modern tools, or the complexity of our avionics, we shouldn't just see tech, we should hear the faint whistle of a mosquito diving through the clouds and the hum of a tiny gyroscope spinning at 5,000 RPM in the dark. We should remember that this path toward automation was paved by men who were tired of being mocked by an enemy they couldn't hit. The story of the Gyro Gunsight and the U-88 is a reminder that while the machines change, the human spirit that drives them remains constant. We are still the Sentinels, and we are still searching for ways to turn the calculus of death into a calculus of victory. As we look back from the vantage point of the 21st century, we can tip our caps to that black box in the cockpit, the invisible hand that proved once and for all that the right tool in the right hands doesn't just change a battle, it changes history. If you appreciate the mechanical ingenuity of this era as much as we do, I'd invite you to join our growing community of history enthusiasts. These stories of the invisible hand and the men who flew into the dark are too often lost to the noise of modern life, and by subscribing, you're helping us keep that history alive. If you remember these aircraft, or perhaps have a connection to the engineers and pilots who changed the course of the air war, please share those thoughts in the comments below. We read every one of them because the best history isn't found in textbooks, but in the shared memories of those who respect the craft. Thank you for spending your time with us today, and we look forward to seeing you in the next deep dive.